Hi, my name is Jonathan Suarez, and I'm going to be doing a presentation on the globalization of one of the biggest companies known to man at this moment in time, Apple. So let me just get right into it. Steve Jobs and Steve Wozniak are not just any regular names that are overlooked if one were to come across these names in a newspaper or a magazine. These names are on an entirely different level. Some people, including myself, would label them as iconic or revolutionary names in history. Why, might you ask? It's because these people are responsible for starting the most profitable company of all time, right next to Amazon at least. This company is called Apple. May even be listening to my speech on an Apple device at this very moment, just to show how big it is. And to put into more context of how many people actually own products that are made by Apple, there are 325.7 million people that are living in America, right? Therefore, if 65% of the population owns an Apple product, which they do, that means that 211 million people own Apple products. And that's just in America, where we Americans only count for 5% of the entire world's population. Apple has a very long and rich background, starting with Steve Jobs and Steve Wozniak working in a garage, attempting to build something to put some money in their pockets, just like any other business person looking to make a startup would. In the beginning of their journey, Jobs and Wozniak faced problems any other startup company might face. However, when you scale to the giant corporate company that Apple has scaled to, your problems begin to shift a little. They begin to have setbacks that, if handled wrong, could potentially affect thousands and even millions of lives. A big reason for this, for the new problems that they faced, is that Apple began to partake in globalization. Now, globalization can be defined as the process by which businesses or other organizations develop international influence or start operating on an international scale. As some may know, Apple now outsources the manufacturing of a majority of their parts to China. Outsourcing has many benefits, especially when it comes to the overall cost. But on the contrary, there are a lot of risks that are being taken by doing so. Now, Apple has an extremely high amount of influence in not only America but across the world. So this means that when Apple is potentially making a major decision, like the one they made to outsource the manufacturing of the iPhone, it's crucial that they keep in mind the way that other countries that are involved with Apple are affected. For example, because they outsource their manufacturing from China, they take into account how it will affect China's economy, and not just their economy, but their overall population. A lot of times, when a company is deciding whether or not to outsource their manufacturing, there is a lot of ethical questions that could come along with it. And not just questions, a lot of ethical problems that they might have to deal with that aren't just a simple yes or no. These problems affect, like I mentioned before, hundreds of thousands of lives and could potentially even affect millions of lives. So, because they have so much on their mind and so much to account for that they're accountable for, it's important that before they actually sign their name to really anything, to complete any kind of deal with any kind of country, that executives of the country take into consideration how they will deal with the potential ethical dilemmas that they will face in the future. So before I get to answering some of the important questions that are at hand, I want to speak a little bit about the background of the company. As mentioned before, Apple started with the two geniuses, Steve Jobs and Steve Wozniak, in their garage trying to fill out a small order for a technology vendor, a local technology vendor. They told the owner of the store, or they sold the owner of the store on the idea that they would be able to make the first personalized computers. As computers prior to this were solely for business people, and not just any business people, but for only really large businesses, as they were the only ones that would be able to afford such a luxury. In the 1960s, the computers that business people were buying would cost approximately $1 million, which seems like a lot. Well, because it is a lot. But to for you to see that, just to see how much it really is, $1 million back then would have valued to about $8 million today, when taking inflation into consideration. Eventually, a huge breakthrough in Apple's technology was birthed with the Lisa program. Now, this Lisa program was able to revolutionize technology and the ways in which personalized computers were put to use. So, in January 19th, 1983, it was one of the first personalized computers to offer a GUI, which stands for a graphical user interface. Now, this graphical user interface completely revolutionized the way that computers would be used back then and would be used forever. Before GUI interface was introduced to the computer market, they used to use a complicated system called CLI, which stands for Command Line Interface. Basically, command line interface was possible to use, but you had to have an in-depth knowledge of coding, and it just made things very, very difficult. With GUI, however, instead of having to learn all the coding, one was able to click on icons and interact with individual elements in order to perform tasks. As computers that incorporated this incredible new technology started to skyrocket in sales, the company was just destined to expand. It even got into some legal troubles because at the time Steve Jobs was not only considering leaving, but actually left the company for a while, went to Microsoft, and tried to basically implement the same GUI technology that they were using at Apple. However, it really didn't work out too well, and thank God for all of us, I guess he actually ended up going back to Apple and working on the GUI even more and really perfecting it instead of having it where Apple wasn't perfected and Microsoft wasn't perfected, and we might not be where we are today with this kind of interface if he wasn't able to go back there. But nonetheless, once he did go back and they were able to consider expanding in 1983 over the enormous success of their innovative technology, they were able to label themselves as a Fortune 500 company, solidifying themselves as legends and huge players in the technology space. With all of this change happening so rapidly and the executives of the company looking to expand not only their brand but their company, talks of globalization really became a reality and not just something that could be talked about in the future, but was being talked about as movements for the present. The decision to partake in globalization was not an easy one for everybody, however. Particularly, Steve Jobs had a really tough time with bringing his company overseas. Steve Jobs took a tremendous amount of pride in having a machine that was not only for Americans at the time, but made in America as well. As time continued, though, the company decided that moving their company's manufacturing overseas would be the best economic decision for the company. In 2004, with the emergence of the iPhone, which was set to revolutionize the phone industry, Apple made the risky yet calculated move to outsource their assembly of their biggest product to date into China. Apple explained that the biggest reason that they decided to outsource their assembly is because based off the fact that the company they were dealing with was extremely adaptable to change. For example, shortly before the release of the iPhone, Jobs wanted to add a glass screen to the phone as opposed to the typical plastic screens that were used. Most manufacturers would not have been able to fulfill such orders without pushing the release date. However, the Chinese manufacturer was able to. Though the risks were relatively low when compared to using other manufacturers, a risk that they had to consider was losing the Made in America title, which some people strongly considered when purchasing. I know on a personal level that that's something that my dad, as a veteran, he likes to take pretty serious too. So I would imagine, I know for a fact that he's not the only one. There's definitely a market for people that are looking for made in America brands and want to support American economy in that type of way. So when it comes to countries winning or losing as a direct result of Apple outsourcing to China, to put it quite simply, I tend to label China as the overall winner and America kind of as the loser. I base this solely on the potential jobs. Due to this transformational deal, Apple created hundreds of thousands of jobs in China. However, if they were able to keep the manufacturing in America, which I admit probably wouldn't be the best economical move, as it might not have saved them a lot of money, actually would have cost them extra money because of our labor laws and our higher pay. Nonetheless, though, if they would have stayed in America, those jobs, that all those hundreds of thousands of jobs that were created in China and all those hundreds of thousands of families that were positively affected because of Apple wanting to move their company to China, well, those jobs and the help to those families would have been given to American families, and they would have been American jobs. Though costs would eventually prove to be lower as a result of the move to China, like I stated previously, this came with an ethical battle that executives would be forced to address. For example, in China, the labor laws are not as regulated as they are in America. In China, working conditions are allowed to be poor, which has proved to have a negative impact on the overall health of the employees. There are plenty of sob stories of people, children actually, not even just adults. Because when you think of when I say people in a manufacturing job, I would imagine that most people, as including myself, would picture an adult working in a manufacturing. But a lot of these companies in China are actually employing very young kids working on big machines that it can be really dangerous. People lose limbs. You can even lose your life. And it also doesn't help with all the smoke and all the pollution in the air in these manufacturing buildings, especially for underdeveloped or non-developed kids. So another thing that affects the ethical decision that they would have to address are basically all the employees having to work overtime hours without pay. They are also given very little salaries when compared to American salary. It's not easy dealing with dilemmas like this. In theory, Apple could really make a strong push to reform working conditions and the way in which the employees are being treated. However, it could come with consequences. These consequences potentially include severing very valuable relationships with Chinese manufacturers. I have a lot of mixed feelings about that, because although you could potentially be severing relations with Chinese manufacturers, at what cost does that come with, right? So I understand from a monetary standpoint that, when we're thinking very linear, A plus B equals C, lower costs equal keeping your prices down and being able to sell more, and that all makes sense. But are you as a company, do you as a company want to be known as the company that is essentially okaying putting all of those underage workers at risk? Are you okay with really severely underpaying your employees that work for you just because their government allows it? I strongly believe that if I were to start my own company, it would be crucial for me to stand by my own morals, regardless of the morals of their country's government. That really shouldn't affect how you treat your employees. But it's neither here nor there. Coming from an American point of view, I believe that major companies outsourcing to places like China who condone this condition is not good for the American economy as well. If smaller companies see Apple outsourcing, then they will be encouraged to do so, preventing the availability of new jobs that Americans could use. The fewer jobs available, the less wealthy the overall population becomes, which translates to less spending, resulting in a negative impact on the overall economy. Apple has come a very long way from the garage that they originated in with Steve Jobs and Steve Wozniak. They have been able to participate in globalization to the fullest with influence all around the world. I hope that more based I hope that more American based companies are able to find this level of success and keep jobs in America.